Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, which I think is no one looking around, I am Ranjana Khanna, and I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, which is where you are this morning. Starting last semester and over this semester, we're hosting a series of discussions about the humanities at Duke as a way of highlighting the distinctiveness of the effort at Duke, the ongoing high quality of the research and scholarship in this area, and a commitment, perhaps we should even say at this point, the right to a humanities education. As you know, the story goes that in the 1980s, when a decision was made to make Duke into a top-notch university, there was substantial investment into the humanities, and much effort was made to hire scholars who were already established and who had a vision for what our fields might be or could look like. In turn, they hired people, both senior and junior, to fulfill those roles with innovative ideas and a sense of potentiality, or of what it meant at that time to build an institution with a leading and robust humanities for the late 20th century. Many of those people were and remain some of the most significant scholars of our time. As you all know, we have lost one of our most cherished colleagues in the humanities recently, someone I know that Stanley and Jane would have loved to be in conversation with today, author of 30 books, a 40-year career at Duke, winner of our field's Nobel Prize equivalent, the Holberg Prize in 2008, friend, teacher, colleague, brilliant scholar, Fred Jameson. Now, even though the memorial was decidedly not Fred's mode, in his joyful approach to everything, every piece of knowledge he could find, every colleague he wanted to speak to, I would like to take a moment of silence for him this morning. Many have written recently of Fred's extraordinary curiosity and generosity that created something very special at Duke. Those who arrived with him in the 1980s brought with them, it seems to me, experiences from other universities and thrilling times in the development of humanities research. Sometimes these were in moments of upheaval, scholarly, politically, intellectually, that allowed for new visions and sometimes total meltdowns. Certainly, certainly they were in response to a sense of a need for change, such that, for example, desegregation at universities was not just a matter of inclusion, but could force a shift in discussion that demonstrated the need for attention to a supplement that upheld a status quo, or the change in an understanding of post-colonial studies that allowed us to see how colonial education functioned in different places. That status quo often prevented academics from being innovative, more than tools of the state, troubling, daring all scales of their scholarship. Upholding the highest standards of the protocols of analysis in their fields, such that they could produce responsible scholarship about how people had made sense in a variety of cultural forms of the world that they lived in, remained a priority, but also one that could actually be shifted. In this series so far that marks FHI's 25th anniversary and Duke's 100th, we have heard from Kathy Davidson and Carla Holloway, and Carla's with us today, on the idea to create a humanities institute at Duke, and specifically one that bore the name of John Hope Franklin. We have also heard from Gregson Davis, who reflected on his career in the classics and comparative literature and what he brought to Duke through a consideration of the structures of colonial education that cemented both the love and care for works that were shaping tradition and radically questioning them, and the particular moments of change he participated in at Berkeley in the 60s, Stanford at the height of the culture wars, and Cornell during and in the aftermath of the theory wars and the beginnings of the ethical turn. I'm delighted today that we have Stanley Fish and Jane Tompkins with us. The format today is that each of them will speak for about 20 minutes, and we'll then have a conversation with them, at which time you'll be able to ask questions. And I'm now going to call on my colleague Tom Ferraro, Professor of English, to introduce them. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
I know almost everybody, but not quite. This is an immense privilege and a long overdue wondrous event. I have foregone the anecdotes, which would take time. I learned many things from Srinivas, and one of them was to watch your timing. Stanley and Jane, Jane and Stanley. All right, here's the formal intro. The world of literary and cultural inquiry know you as the foremost thinker writers of your era, and by intellectual longevity, mine and Julia's. From Surprised by Sin in 1967 to 2024's Law at the Movies, you, Stanley, Professor Fish, have been our #1 agent provocateur for articulating and operationalizing the counter sense of anti-foundationalism, a process experienced by your reader not only as ontological deflation and epistemological expose, but as a rallying, often rollicking, always enabling scene of instruction, utterly humane in its presumed anti-humanism, reading subversively as equipment for living, and doing so in pitch-perfect diction delivered by killer-perfect syntax, as you explain yourself in How to Write a Sentence and put into play in myriad books, articles, and op-ed pieces, often with legal tangles and social considerations of major import. Prophetic, too, as in, there's no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing, too. Break. A kindred theorist to Stanley, Professor Tompkins, you, Jane, have long been our driving force in the feminist reconfiguration of the American literary canon, bringing sentimental and popular fiction out from under the dark shadows of critical dismissal, voicing the imaginative hold of major texts upon staggering numbers of common readers, and registering the social forces, indeed utopian vision of Protestant sentimentality, especially sentimental power enough to mobilize the Civil War. Under the sway of your sensational designs, the new criticism that Derrida had effectively recast in Talmudic debate finally lost its hold. The classroom, not so much, on we Americanists. As all of us leveraged your formulation of the cultural work of American fiction, you turned mythopoetic yourself in the greatest treatment we have of the most American of genres, west of everything, gorgeously written and ever germane. It holds up. More recently, you have gone reflexive, teaching us first the techniques of the open, student-driven classroom, and then, in convalescence, how sustained reading enables the interplay of souls and thus self-discovery, driving home the difference between the novels that drained you and the novels that energized. In the meantime, as if nothing better to do, you transformed several institutions of higher learning and knowledge pursuit, including Duke University, which went from regional modesty to major player and global force, well beyond its previous BME powers. Of course, you procured help with impeccable acumen and formidable taste. As I recall, Frank preceded the quiet godfather to us all, but then our beloved Fred and Susan, I'm going to do roll call, Barbara, Annabelle and Lee, Naomi, Walter, younger folks too, Eve, Skip, Kathy, Alice, Carla, Jan, Sarah and Thomas, Roberto, Alberto, and Teresa. I could go on and on. A litany of founders and shapers, given inspiration by the dynamic due to outrageous curiosity and the highest bar, to which I will also like to add your support for regenerating careers that had been on hold or in arrears, surely John Clum's and possibly Mariana's too. You pressed the academy to be more rewarding. You made Duke and the press and FHI thrive in the lives of its scholar writers possible. And more besides. Post-humanism in thought, okay, Stanley. I love its rhythms of illumination, but visionary all the way, empathetic to the core, like Jane. Thank you, and welcome back.
Thank you both for those kind words, or more than kind words. Is this working? Just that I'm shorter than you. I'd hoped to remedy that, but it hasn't worked out. First, a program note. Neither Jane nor I had seen the other's paper. I thought this was a good idea. Yeah. I thought it was a good idea after 46 years, you know. Let's see how it works out. In another note, I want to say also how much the shadow of Fred Jameson is felt in this event. He was an extraordinary bearer of the energy that vitalized and revitalized the Duke Humanities community. But he was also a national, indeed international energy, whose ideas, whose analyses, whose calls to action garnered responses from scholars in every country. He was an extraordinary person. And I did indeed hope that he would be a third in our conversation today, but that was not to be. Back in 1985, Jane Tompkins and I were in the kitchen of our Baltimore house when the phone rang. I picked it up to hear, "Hello, this is Ernestine Friedel, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Duke. I'm calling to offer you and Jane Tompkins senior positions in the English department." I found, since Jane and I had never applied to Duke and had never visited the campus, I found this statement surprising and even mysterious, and blurted out this reply. "You mean you're inviting us to be candidates for an appointment?" "No," she said, and remade the offer. Later, I found out what had happened. The senior administration had informed departments that funds might become available for new hires, and asked for a list of scholars departments would be interested in approaching were the opportunity to arise. Jane and I were on the English department's list, the work, I believe, of Franklin Tricchia, and Friedel turned that fact into the assumption, wholly unwarranted that the department had voted positively on our candidacy, a candidacy that was invented after the fact. We knew nothing of this. Not surprisingly, more than a few department members were quite put out by this subterfuge, and so we walked into a context of resentment without being aware of it. Of course, at that time, that was standard Duke English Department operating procedure. After the phone call, there were 2 visits. 2, because as far as Jane was concerned, and she can tell this story better than I, the first visit was a disaster, as she was ignored, abandoned, patronized, and dismissed. A second visit, organized by the provost just for her, went better, but not better enough. And for the next few weeks, Jane and I had the same conversation. She listed the reasons why she couldn't imagine going to Duke, and I was unable to say anything forceful in response. One day, when we were in a hotel room in Providence, Rhode Island, she gave her reasons again, and I said something that finally made an impression. I said, "I'll change it." When I informed Johns Hopkins that I was leaving, one of my senior colleagues in the English department exclaimed, "People like us don't go to Duke." I knew what he meant. In 1985, Duke was not the university it is today, mentioned in the same breath as Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. Rather, it was a good regional university with some first-rate professional schools, medicine, law, forestry, divinity, but a set of arts and science departments that fell short of being truly distinguished. The university thought of itself as being in competition with Emory and Vanderbilt, and looked upward to the unattainable heights, it was thought, of the University of Virginia. If you were a scholar from England, France, or Germany, looking for places in the United States to try out your newest ideas, Duke would not be on your schedule. The English department was populated by men. There were almost no women, many of whom regarded their being at Duke as a sign of failure. They should have been in Cambridge or Princeton or New Haven, where they had received their degrees. Instead, they were stuck in Durham. There's a country song there somewhere. They were stuck in Durham, marking out the times of careers whose early promise had not been realized. Some of them had been drawn to Durham by the presence of the Journal of American Literature, the official organ of the American Literature section of the Modern Language Association. That journal, established in 1929, was more or less the department's identity. And in fact, there are some alive who may still tremble at the names of J. Hubble and Clarence Godis, as there certainly were when we began. So the department was at that time traditional, historical, and non-theoretical. Not anti-theoretical, which would have assumed knowledge of theory, but non-theoretical. Now, there is nothing wrong with work that is traditional, historical, and non-theoretical. I've done more than a little bit of it myself. But in 1985, that was not where the action was. The theory boom had been going since the late 60s. New historicism was no longer new. Feminism was in its second or third wave, depending on where you were located. Black studies departments had been established in many colleges and universities. What was then called gay and lesbian studies was growing more energetic by the day. And at Duke, not long before we arrived, there had been a debate in the department about whether genre courses were respectable. Clearly, there was something to do and room to do it in. But why do it? I can't speak for anyone else, but I can tell you that my motives were not ideological or even intellectual. They were professional. That is, what interested me was the possibility of taking an organization that, while not wholly dysfunctional, was slow-moving, set in its outdated ways, at once complacent and insecure, and making it into something vibrant, ambitious, and the center of attention. I didn't want to make the world better, or expand the canon, or open up opportunities for women and minorities. I just wanted to beat the other guys. But not so simple a task. The obvious strategy was to lure high-profile scholars away from institutions Duke would not have thought of competing with in 1985. That was the flashy public relations part, and it was made possible by a university administration that had decided to put its money on the humanities, given that building up the sciences is an enormously expensive project. As a former dean, I can tell you that setting up a lab for a new assistant professor in biology could cost you $1 million. Of course, stockpiling academic stars does not ensure success. I could give you a list of institutions headed by Emory and Northwesterns, never a bride, headed by Emory and Northwestern, that tried and then fizzled out when after a few years their overpriced prizes left to take up positions at the newest entrepreneur on the block. The trick was to avoid aging superstars looking to retire without retiring, my present status, and also to avoid overhyped hustlers peddling a method that would flame out in a few years, like, for example, in Renaissance studies of my time, numerology. We began, as has already been said, with a foundation laid by Franklin Tricchia, who arrived first. Then Jane and I and Fred Jameson and Susan Willis, we came together and talked on the telephone when making our decisions. And in a few years, Barbara Herrnstein-Smith, Annabelle Patterson, Lee Patterson, Kathy Davidson, Janice Radway, Eve Sedgwick, Skip Gates, Carla Holloway, Houston Baker, then a number of younger scholars like Tom Ferraro and Tom Fowle and Michael Moses. Michael Moses and I taught Tom Fowle how to play basketball, an act we forever regretted. But none of this imported talent would have flourished had the soil been inhospitable. You can't just take a bunch of scholars out of the cosmopolitan environment they had been accustomed to and helicopter them into the quite different environment of a department that looked more to the South Atlantic Modern Language Association than to the National Association for its professional ties. That department would have to have its ways and mores changed if the transplant were to be successful. One thing that needed to be changed was the physical plant. The department's offices were where they are, I suppose, now, the third floor of the Allen Building. But because of restrictions in space, some department members were housed in the library and in the social sciences building. That problem was solved one day when I walked through that half of the third floor then occupied by the university's accounting department. I looked around, waved my hands, and said to someone, a very surprised someone, sitting at a desk, I want this. After a conversation with an administration intent on protecting its recent investment, I got it. Of course, if you're going to renovate one half of a floor, why not at the same time renovate the half you've already lived in? In a short time, that was done, and we had a physical environment that was brand new. But the department's culture was still old, and changing it was a more difficult task than knocking down a few walls. First and foremost, there was the problem of morale, especially with respect to a large group of apparently lifetime associate professors who had pretty much given up and were just playing out the string. Their salaries were commensurate with their failed ambitions, scandalously low. Now, the salary bit was relatively easy. The chairman had a lump sum, recently augmented to distribute, and I took a sizable chunk of it and tried as best I could to address longstanding inequities. I did that 3 years running. But charity can be demeaning and wouldn't have the desired effect. A second strategy went more to the heart of the matter. I met with associate professors with each associate professor and offered him, they were all hims, a deal. You take that long-deferred project off the shelf and complete it, and I'll get you promoted. Almost everyone I spoke to took the deal. One who did not said in a tone I will never forget, "You came too late for me." There was still the issue of integration. In effect, there were now two departments and the consequent danger of a two-tiered structure. In an effort to soften the divide, eliminating it entirely was a goal too far. I removed the course load distinction between senior and junior professors. I then instituted a series of regular workshops where faculty presented work in progress and veteran members of the department were prominently featured. The message was clear. We're all in this together, and everyone is a contributor to what we were building. I also appointed long-term department members to key positions: associate chair, chair of undergraduate studies, chair of graduate studies. At the same time, Jane and I gave a series of large parties in our backyard in the hope, partially realized, that social ease and fellowship might translate into professional ease and fellowship. Now, I did all these things by what we now call executive order. Yes, I did them with immunity, as it were, and without the benefit of votes. One colleague asked me when we would meet to formulate bylaws. I said, "No bylaws, my laws." And I got away with it. That's always surprised me. Why anybody? I don't know. There remained the university beyond the department. Any attempt to alter the nature of a unit within a whole will not succeed unless the whole is somewhat altered too. Back then, a first-rate university would be marked by, among other things, a very good library, a very good bookstore, and a very good university press. And 1 out of 3 wasn't good enough. The library at Duke was fine. The bookstore was sleepy and provincial. The press was moribund. It existed, but after a sustained campaign and many conversations, the university negotiated an agreement with Barnes & Nobles, and lo and behold, we had a bookstore whose inventory actually included recent work in every academic field. The press presented a greater challenge. When I talked about the university with friends from other institutions and mentioned the press, they would often say, "I didn't know Duke had a press." When I went to the MLA and walked through the book exhibits, I saw the Duke and North Carolina booths side by side. The Carolina booth was crowded, and practically no one was at the Duke booth, for a good reason. There was nothing of interest to look at. The press was subsidized, and inside the senior administration, there was talk of closing it. I registered my usual complaints, made lots of noise, but nothing happened. Until one day when I was at a conference in California, I got a call from the then provost, Tommy Langford, and Steve Cohen, head of the press's journal division. "Would you consider being executive director of the press?" they asked. It was kind of like being offered a position in the English department out of the blue, but with even less justification. I had zero experience in the university press world, except as an author. I believe the idea was Steve Cohen's, and he sold it to Langford, who sold it, one must assume, to the president, Nan Cohen. It turned out, however, that the sale was not firm. For when I went to Cohen's office, she told me that she was having second and third thoughts. News had gotten out, and several prominent conservative faculty members had protested the appointment, fearing, it seems, that I would make the press into an organ of the Communist Party. A rather testy conversation between us ensued, in which Cohen said she wanted to wait and see if things settled down before proceeding. And I replied that in my experience, those who waited for the perfect moment to do something ended up doing nothing. That was not received well, and I left the meeting quite angry. and convinced that this new chapter would never be opened. But then in a few days, she called, and I had the job, and I don't know why. And so I became a press director, propped up and guided by a superlative staff of editors, production and marketing people, and a crackerjack sales department, rather. All we needed was a product. And we got that by executing a simple strategy. Many of us knew younger scholars doing new and groundbreaking work. We called them up and offered a publishing opportunity in the company of like-minded authors. Fred Jameson proposed that he and I co-edit a series and get it started by putting our next books into it. He called the series Post-Contemporary Interventions. I said, but Fred, that doesn't mean anything. And he replied, exactly. One thing led to another, one friend spoke to another, and in a remarkably short time, we had a press list everyone was talking about and reading. And at the MLA, you couldn't get near the Duke booth. All the while, the national and local press were paying attention. Some good, some bad. The Durham Herald wrote editorials denouncing us. The New York Times published a cover story featuring us and describing Jane as the crown jewel of the department. In the Wall Street Journal, David Brooks, later to be my colleague at the New York Times, wrote a piece entitled From Westerns to Westerns as Lit. George H.W. Bush made a reference to Brooks's piece in his attack on political correctness in the universities. Dinesh D'Souza devoted a scathing chapter to us in his book, Illiberal Education. Now, those who lambasted us believed that introducing theory into the classroom would mean the end not only of literature, but of Western civilization. And some of the theorists they criticized did believe that taking literary text out of their aesthetic cocoon would alter not only the literary landscape, but the landscape of politics in general. Western civilization, as we have known it, would be replaced by something better and inclusive. Both sides were wrong. No politics follows from theory, literary or any other. Neither the fears trumpeted by one side nor the hubristic hopes of the other are realizable, at least as the consequence of what is assigned in the classroom. It was thus, I think, a false issue, that is, the politicization of literary theory, both on the part of its detractors and of its polemicists. It was a false issue, a big energy, but a mistake, a big mistake rather, but a mistake with energy. And that energy put English departments in a spotlight they had long sought, but now found uncomfortable. Beware of what you wish for. And then, after a while, quite a while, 12, 13 years, when a few of the chosen unchose themselves and left, there appeared a string of articles trumpeting the decline of the Duke English department, the bursting of the bubble, the end of the dream, the failure of the experience, the collapse of theory, and the return of Western civilization. What a saga. They ought to make a movie. So, in the end, what was it all about? What was accomplished? What values were honored and strengthened? How were the goals of education furthered? What victories were won for diversity, equity, and inclusion? What new paths in the humanities were charted? What did we do to help save the world? I have spent a lifetime running away from questions like those, and I'm not done running yet. Thank you.
Telling the same story, but let me see.
Don't worry. Just don't worry.
Okay, it all started with Franklin Tricchia. I don't know how many of you knew him, But when the administration decided it wanted to upgrade the English department, which was considered both corrupt and out of date, Frank was the person who stepped in and told them what to do. And he told them about all the people that Stanley said, and the university went ahead and followed his lead. So, and their effort was successful. Once Fred and Susan came and Stanley and I came, then we started hiring, and all the other people came, which I don't need to name their names all again. But suddenly Duke was on the map, the professional map of, who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out, that kind of map. And these people that came, like Skip Gates and Eve Sedgwick, were heavy hitters. Everybody knew who they were. And when the Duke English department gave a party at the meetings of the Modern Language Association, you didn't have trouble getting close to the Duke press booth, but no, you couldn't get in the room. It was so jammed. It was literally packed. You couldn't get in the room of the Duke party. And when you were standing on the elevator, looking at everybody's name tag, the name you wanted on the institutional name you wanted on your tag was Duke University. And that's the way it was. It was great, really. It was fun to have that kind of, rush of celebrity or whatever. In the beginning, when we got here, it was not so great. The first time I came to Duke, the second time I came to Duke, actually, the one that Philip Griffith engineered because I was so badly treated the first time around when I came with Stanley, I was met at the airport by 3 women. Before we even got to the parking lot, they were talking about how terrible things were for women at Duke. I mean, they couldn't start talking about it soon enough. There were 5 female full professors on campus, arts and sciences, 5, count them, 5 female full professors. It was hard, if not impossible, to get tenure here. As I talked with these 3 women, it was like we were housemaids in upstairs, downstairs, talking below stairs about the masters, the people who ran things, the people who, were senior. It was all the men. It was literally, I'm not exaggerating. It had that quality of the disenfranchised, the ones who didn't matter. It was not a good introduction. I mean, here, these were the women who were chosen to pick me up, and they were like telling me how bad things were for women. I emphasized the gender composition of the faculty because it had the biggest impact on me. There were other great absences as well. It's safe to say that neither Susan Willis nor I would have been hired if we hadn't been attached to big stars in the field. It was star quality that the administration was aiming for, not equality. Okay, but I personally was very well treated by Ernie Friedel, who was the dean then, a lovely person. She gave me a very fair offer. She made me feel respected. There was not she was wonderful, personally. Philip Griffiths was the same. Dick White, who succeeded Ernie Friedel, was also really good. So the administration was much more welcoming than the English department for reasons that you've just heard. The atmosphere was neither supportive nor friendly. The men who ran it weren't used to having women around, talking, opening their mouths, having opinions, They just tolerated and barely tolerated the women who were there already. When I complained about this to Stanley, and he's already cited this event, this moment, he said, "I'll change that." He said, "I'll change it." And so he did. I mean, I was in on it too, but it was mainly him who did the work. So Eve Sedgwick, Annabelle Patterson, Barbara Smith, Kathy Davidson, Toril Moy, Janice Radway. Not all of the women were feminists exactly, but as I learned, body count really matters. It matters more than ideology, body count. Not only was the English department not a friendly environment, neither was the university as a whole, or for that matter, for me, North Carolina. And that was a different matter. I'm a born and bred New Yorker, okay? I spent my whole life in the Northeast, except for a couple of little sojourns in California. One Sunday afternoon, when I was attending a reception at my own house, which was actually for somebody who was a friend of mine who had been invited by the literature program to come and lecture for a week, I went upstairs, took off my good earrings, put on my jeans, getting ready to go to the Durham homeless shelter where I volunteered every week on Sunday nights. And I was so happy to be able to go to the homeless shelter. Got it? At that time, the early days here, the two places I was most comfortable in were the homeless shelter, with the men at the homeless shelter, and Duke Forest with my dog, Ribbon. But things were not all bad. Being a full professor and with my husband as chair, it turned out I could really do what I wanted. It was open season for me. And I was ready at that point, although I wasn't aware of it then, to break out, to go against the norms not only of my discipline, American literature, by teaching outside the literary canon, but also the norms of classroom teaching itself. I worried that the unorthodox things I was doing, like teaching a graduate course on the place of emotion in Western culture, in which people were encouraged to express their emotions fully and freely, might get me kicked out. But of course, that never happened. At Duke, I could devise whatever kind of course my heart desired. I taught Western novels and films, essentially a course on the construction of male identity in the 20th century. And it was a course I loved. And I ended up writing a book on the basis of it. I taught popular women's novels of the 19th century, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Susan Warner, Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, people you've never heard of. And then I went a step further and taught popular women's novels of the 20th century, which is even worse. Valley of the Dolls, can you imagine? I spent a lot of time convincing the students in that course that they weren't wasting their parents' money by reading novels long considered trash by the literary establishment. It was an uphill struggle and a lot of fun. In these courses, I initiated the practice of student group presentations, an idea I got from Alice Kaplan, who was a colleague in the French department. I didn't have these ideas about what to do and how to change the classroom myself. I sort of borrowed them from other places, and then once I got going, I went on my own. But I really liked this. I passed out at the beginning of the course a little chart with the dates on which certain novels or films were going to be discussed, and had people sign up for 2 or 3 of them. And so there were little groups for every class period responsible for presenting the material. And I got to just love sitting in the back of the room and having somebody else do my job. Plus, it was very enlivening. It made the class so much more alive because the students didn't felt more comfortable questioning what their colleagues said than what the professor said. And also, I had gotten tired of just standing up there all by myself and telling people what to think. It was lonely. It was lonely. I also was sort of evolving in my notions of what is a proper response to a literary text. The idea that your response needs to be primarily intellectual no longer satisfied me. I began taking students on trips suggested by what we were reading. Actually, they ended up taking me because they were much better at, figuring out what motel and making reservations and things like that. They were great at doing stuff like that. So in addition to supplying material for analytical essays, books could lead you out into the world, cause you to see new things and have new experiences. It was a question of responding in an active physical way to what they brought up, rather than in a purely cerebral one. The experiences I remember best were connected to a course that focused exclusively on Moby Dick and Beloved, the great epic novel of the 19th and then of the 20th century. We went to the coast. We went to the coast for Moby Dick. We sat around a fire on the beach at night, and each person was asked to talk about the most remarkable experience they'd ever had involving water. It was very exciting. And the next morning, at breakfast, everyone had been asked to choose a passage from Moby Dick that was their favorite passage, and to read it aloud, in such a way that they would put the passage over. When you ask a student to read something aloud, often they sound as if they were in second grade and they stumble and so forth. But that was not permitted here, and there were different accents. I remember I had a student from Switzerland who had a German accent, and there were other accents, and it was wonderful to hear Melville's language spoken with these different intonations and inflections. Anyway, so let's see. For Beloved, we visited a former plantation, and we were introduced to I don't remember very many details about what the lives of the slaves were like, and I still have a broom that was made from stalks of, I don't know, straw, broom wrapped at the top, that maybe we made them ourselves, I don't remember, that the slaves had used to sweep the brooms out. And I asked the students while we were there, to sit down and write a brief story from the point of view of a slave. I asked them to imagine themselves as a slave and to write a little anecdote from that person's point of view. So because of these trips, I got to know my students better. Students whose skills are not primarily academic can take the lead in situations where arranging and organizing are prominent, and you're in a car with 5 people, and who's the jokester, who's the person with a great sense of humor, who's the boss, who's the person you can count on when things go wrong, So these trips were joint ventures in the sense that the students did a lot of the organizing, and they lessened the loneliness I often felt as a professor, supposed authority up there in front of the room by myself, dispensing knowledge. The satisfaction that I got from stepping out of bounds like this led me to become much more interested in the students themselves than I ever had been, and eventually more interested in the students than I was in my own subject matter. Or it mattered more to me to get to know the students than to get them to know, which is how I started out, the very latest stuff that was being written about whoever we were studying. I was one of these, right on the head of the curve on whatever was happening. And that was my ideal when I started teaching. But I wanted to know more about these students, who they were, what experiences had formed them, what they aspired to. And this led to my teaming up with a woman named Martha Simmons, who had founded the Women's Center at Duke and who had taught under the auspices of Duke Chapel. Her understanding of people went way beyond mine. I was just starting to be interested in people, actually. You don't go into the academic world by accident. I figured that most professors go there because you don't have to face yourself and you don't have to face other people. You just have to go to the library. You see what I mean? From her, I learned how to create an atmosphere in class where students were able to talk honestly about their own lives. Here were all these talented, interesting young people about to embark on their life's work, who in many cases, most cases probably, had no idea of what they wanted to do, who they wanted to be, or who they even were. So she and I put together a course called Writing Spiritual Autobiography. It just covered a lot of bases. The first time we taught it, we had St. Augustine and Pilgrim's Progress and all this stuff. After that, we dispensed with most of the reading because it turned out to be a course in self-discovery where the students thought and wrote and talked about themselves. Well, in response to assignments that we gave them. Just to give you a couple of examples, an early assignment in the course was to write a paper on that part of yourself that you felt you had somehow lost, that used to be there for you, that used to be important in your life and that you no longer had access to. The crucial assignment in the course came in the 5th week, where we asked students to write a paper on that event or set of circumstances in their lives after which nothing was ever the same again. That assignment, which we had students report on in class, tell one another about, we sat in a circle, that was the turning point of the course, because when students heard the things that each other had to say, there was a kind of a new sense of trust and fellow feeling of community, of feeling of we be of one blood, thou and I. It was the most satisfying course I ever taught. Martha and I taught it 4 times. We participated in the assignments. In that assignment, we participated, and we participated in some of the other assignments. So we were self-disclosing at the same time that the students were. Basically, in teaching that course, I taught my way out of the classroom. When Stan and I left Duke for the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was going to be Dean of Arts and Sciences, I invented a job for myself renovating space. The student-centered course that I had taught with Martha had made me aware of the powerful effect that physical environment, and also my expeditions with the other students in other classes, the powerful effect that physical environment can have on what goes on inside it. Annabelle. After the first few sessions of our class, Martha and I moved it out of the seminar room and into the faculty lounge, which had carpeting, soft seating, low lights, and a very different atmosphere. And that we needed that. We didn't want a blackboard. We didn't want hard surfaces. It makes a difference. It's nothing that you can, well, Annabelle can probably tell you what all the factors are. I can't, but it makes a difference. In the case of the University of Illinois at Chicago, it wasn't just a classroom venue, it was the entire campus that needed to be changed. But for now, what I want to stress is that Duke gave me the chance to grow and evolve, both as a classroom professor and as a human being. When I left Duke, I was not the same person I was when I arrived. And for this, I was not sufficiently grateful at the time. But I am now, in retrospect. I used to go around the country giving talks about my experiments in teaching. And invariably, in the question period, someone would complain, saying that they could never, what I was talking about, all these wild things that I was talking, letting the students lead the class, and were fine for me at Duke, but They could never do that in their institution. They would never get away with it. One person I remember told me that in her college or university, if you were teaching a survey course that other people were teaching, you had to be on the same page in the same book on the same day as everybody else. Still, I mean, to these institutional constraints, I didn't have too much to say, except that I had realized through my experience that you can get away with a lot more in your own classroom than you would think. And I mean, I just went ahead and did these things. I didn't ask permission from anybody. I just went ahead and did them. And of course, my husband was the head of my department, so, you know, who was going to... But anyway, I was able to do these things at Duke. There was no pressure on me to toe the line or act differently. Again, at the time, I didn't give credit to the institution for that. I mentioned that when we left Duke, I made up this job renovating space. The idea of creating new spaces in a university did not start at UIC. It started here at Duke. And this is how it came about. While I was at Duke, I'd been invited to give a 2-week seminar at Emory, a graduate seminar at Emory. And they gave me an apartment on the edge of campus, and I could walk to class. I walked to class, had class, and it turned out that on another edge of campus, there was a row of shops and the couple of places where you could get coffee or lunch or something like that. And so I took to walking from class with students, whoever wanted to come, nobody had to come, to one of these places, and we'd sit down, and it would be much more informal. It would be a little bit like those expeditions where I got to see the other sides of the students and sort of who they were, and they could bring up other topics than the ones we'd been discussing. And I just thought it was very important to me, the ease of this and the sort of the informality and the relaxation I found very appealing in a pedagogical, from a pedagogical viewpoint. So when I got back to Duke, I talked to Dick White about it, who at that point had just hired a woman, an African-American woman, I don't remember her name, unfortunately, to address something that had been a problem here, which was the dominance that were held by fraternities and sororities in the social life of the university. There needed to be other ways that people could get together, kids could get together informally, that the campus, facilitated. And so when I talked about how nice it would be if there were a cafe somewhere where students could go, wouldn't that be great? At the time, the student center was being renovated. And so I got them to put a cafe into the student center. I also started a cafe in one of the libraries. I forget which one it was. And another faculty member started a cafe, I forget who it was, in the other library, whichever was East Campus, West Campus, I don't remember. And then the university itself came up with a great idea of building a separate cafe on East Campus, because Duke the West Campus had the Student Center Cafe, and they needed one on East Campus. So I was already into this process of sort of humanizing isn't exactly the right word, but taking advantage of the ways in which social interaction can extend the teaching learning process. And also just, what's the word, humanize, I suppose, the life of the university in general. At UIC, there was no place like that, no place. It was just terrible. There was a cafeteria, but the cafeteria was noisy and no sense of intimacy or anything like that. There was the library, had a few places to sit down. So anyway, I got the university to invest in a faculty student center and cafe in the main administration building right in the middle of campus, which could be used by any and all people who came to the campus. Parents, people who worked as secretaries, people who worked in maintenance, professors, students, casual visitors, and everybody could come there, sit down, read the newspaper, have coffee and a croissant, and it was, I thought it was great anyway. So the point here is the faculty office isn't the best place to, outside of the classroom. The faculty office, students, you sit behind your desk and the student sits in a chair, is not necessarily the best place to get to know a student or to chat with another person. So I suppose everyone knows this by now, but at that time, there were no such places at Duke. So the university was open to change. For me, it was a place that was open to change. It doesn't look like a place that's open to change with its Gothic buildings and its formal landscaping. And the style of the university is conservative to a degree, really. But it turned out that that as a place for learning and teaching and being, Duke was not so stuffy and staid and stick in the mud as I had presumed it would be. It was not. So by the time I left 13 and a half years after arriving, it felt different to me. I'm sure that lots of other changes that had been going on while I was there were responsible, largely responsible. But the university felt more friendly, less stuffy, and a lot more diverse than it was the evening I got off that plane and had the below-stairs conversation with the 3 women's representatives. I don't know much about what has happened since because I haven't been here and I haven't tried to find out. But I would like to know what changes followed from the ones that I've been talking about and what changes people here would like to put into practice. I wrote a little coda to my paper last night, which is as follows. My own urge in doing the things that I've been telling you about was toward making education more holistic. That's the word, the sort of label. Body, mind, and spirit in the classroom. Experiential rather than purely intellectual. That's not a very clean or dichotomy, but you probably understand what I mean. I had a mentor in this way of thinking about education. It was Parker Palmer, who was a great Quaker educator and has written some very good books. I see somebody is nodding his head. Somebody knows who Parker Palmer is. Great. Well, he is a great person, a great soul. As he would say, not parking sensation, emotion, and the personal life at the door of the classroom, but bringing everything in with you, and thus to become, in his phrase, divided no more. Thank you.
I'm just going to, while everyone's thinking of their questions or their comments, I'm just going to ask one of the things that's very striking to me that you both talked about was how upset you both were at the first visit to Duke. Stanley, you on behalf of Jane, and Jane, you didn't say much about it, but you started with your second visit to start again, as it were, in order to do that. And Jane, you've framed this very much in terms of a moment of poor representation of women on campus, and the need for a major cultural change that allowed women to have a voice on campus, the particular complexity of coming in as a couple complexity, but also the possibilities afforded by that. And Stanley, you insist always on not being interested in the political shifts that you wanted to make on campus, or
in self-disclosure.
right,
The very phrase makes me uneasy.
right, or in self-disclosure, and yet this comment, I'll change it, which is on one level a commitment to your partner, which, you know, I'm sure many of us understand, but it also implies something about a professional need to change something which some would argue is political, right? So I'd love it if you could comment on that, wherever you want to come in on.
Well, any situation, of course, has a politics, and there's a politics of university culture. And you need only to walk into an institution and spend a few hours there, and you'll immediately get the feel of it. For example, Jane and I spent a year at Columbia University in its English department, which one can only describe in a single word: rot. That's
Moribund.
R-O-T. And you knew it within a minute. And in fact, when I first arrived here, another senior colleague, Renaissance scholar in my field named Lee Deneef, said to me in a tone which I've always remembered as the tone of mournful glee. He said, "You'll never be able to do anything here." You know, so and you got that feel. So that the change that has to be made is a change in the terms that Jane employed, although I would never myself employed them, and to make it so that you wanted to walk into the space of work and feel that you were about to enter into conversations and relationships that both made you feel localized in an appropriate way, and also gave you a sense of a common enterprise. And if that's a political goal that I had, I certainly had it. Let me now say something that I should have said before. I meant to say this before the talk. I meant to describe the talk as my Donald Trump talk, because it's incredibly boastful, a long list of the things that I did and that no one else could ever do. And it was also delivered, I delivered the talk, as you yourself can testify, without a trace either of self-reflection or humility. So, but nevertheless, there was a sense that I had and that Jane had and that others had, that we could make this a livable place. And that's what I think we succeeded in doing. I don't want to talk in Camelot terms, but they come to, at least for a while.
Well, just to say, on the academic plane, the academic intellectual plane, there was no intellectual talk in our department. Nobody talked about their work with anybody else that I knew of. I mean, it was, I mean, sometimes the university is the last place that you will find intellectual life, because people are so self-protective. They're so afraid of being you know, found to not know enough or have made some error in logic or something, that they won't expose themselves by talking about what they're really interested in and what they're actually doing. So the series of talks that people gave in the department that you mentioned, where they, you know, there would some faculty member would give a talk on what he or she was working on, were really very important. They were important to me anyway. And I don't know, it's something that I didn't touch on here, but the whole question of real intellectual life in the university is, I mean, there's very little of it. I can see Jim is looking at me in a funny way because Dorianne is like is constantly, talking at a very high level of intellectual conversation. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because people don't talk about it very much.
Well, I mean, I think what you say is very interesting there. You know, I mean, running. I mean, I ran gender, what was then women's studies, but we, at the end of my term, we voted on the change to gender, sexuality, and feminist studies for a while. And one of the things that the faculty would sometimes say was, you know, you're running this as if it's an institute. We're all exhausted because you always organize events to discuss work and that sort of thing. And it's true, I maybe overdid it, and I'm very happy now to have, thanks to Carla and Kathy, the possibility of running this institute, which does try to allow for a certain kind of intellectual life, which sometimes happens in departments, and sometimes because of the subject matter or because of insecurities or because of whatever funding, I mean, a whole array of reasons, doesn't happen within the department, within the department space, and often leads to other kinds of politics in departments because we don't really have a sense of where each other's coming from in terms of our intellectual investments, I think. I mean, I think that's just something that does come up quite a lot. So, I mean, I would love to see if Toril, you have your hand up. Yes.
In 1987, in the fall, and from Norway and England, I had no idea what was going on at Duke, and I didn't know whether Duke had been up or down in the rankings because I knew nothing about American rankings. So I have a question, particularly for Stanley, which is this. Now that we have so sadly lost Fred, I visited the literature program. Originally, I was hired in literature and French, so I had nothing to do with the English department. But I got this sense when I was here, even in that first visit, that there was a kind of cabal or cahoots going on between literature and English. And I do remember you, Stanley, I don't know about you, Jane, but you were a member of the you were both members. Well, this is what I thought, that there were overlaps. And yet, of course, literature over on East, English over on West, but the twain did meet. And I would like you to talk a little, since Fred can't do it, about how the literature program sort of came about, and this tight yet not very, there was a tight interconnection with English in your work. And at the same time, there was a it was a different world in a way, because the lit program was new and English had this staid background. So could you talk a bit about the history of the early days of literature at Duke, given that you're as close to it as anyone will be now?
Well, it was, and in many ways is, Fred's show and accomplishment. And so when I was there at meetings in the literature program, it was largely to attend to what Fred was saying. And what Fred was usually talking about was adjustments to the language exams for students. That's what he was, in other words, people outside the university who heard the word Jameson and then necessarily added the label Marxist would have thought were his uppermost concerns, couldn't have been further from the truth. He wanted to put on a program where students were simultaneously rigorously trained in the most traditional and honorable ways, and also freed to explore new avenues of intellectual work wherever they might have emerged. And as I think the allusion earlier, to Fred's joyous and expansive personality. This is part of what made it possible. Now, his efforts to do this in the early years always ran up against the opposition of a dear friend of ours, Annabelle Patterson, whose instincts were all in the other direction, who would have, had she been able to put us into uniforms and had us marching in place for a long time. So it was a very interesting, but you're right, Toro. There was not a real, a genuine day-to-day or week-to-week interaction between the departments. But I would say that each, in its different way, took comfort from the presence of the other. And there we were, and then kind of infiltrating departments like the French department, which already had Alice Kaplan and others, and to a certain extent, the German department, and in some cases, even speaking to other departments in the university, although some departments, notably philosophy, felt an opposition to everything that we did and stood for, which was absolutely steadfast. It was a very interesting time because, as Jane said, there was a conservative cast or mold to much of what went on. Much of what went on in the university, and therefore the entry into the university of people like us, was at one time a tonic and something greatly to be feared. That's the way it felt, at least for us then. Toro was generous enough not to say publicly what she said to me immediately upon seeing me again after many years. She said, "You promised to build me a city." That was my recruiting pitch to Toro, pretty much the same recruiting pitch I made to Jane. And as I told her, you ain't seen nothing yet.
I think I want to say, for the 3 comments that have been made, all of you, that explains a lot from my experience at Duke. Jane, I remember almost having to reclaim or to establish a distance and an authority about African-American literature, because students came into my classrooms free and open and ready to tell me all about themselves without thinking that I might have something to explain to them about the field. So there was a lot of, there was some undoing of the freedom and privilege that they had in some of the classrooms that extended both to Black and white students. Black students unburdening trauma as a practice was something that I had to pull back from them in order to be whole at Duke, because if their whole story was to tell that they were traumatized in some way, and this has not come certainly from your classroom, but I remember being very angry at the Ford Foundation, saying that when they said, in order to write an essay of application, tell us about the worst thing that ever happened to you for minority students. And I just, this sort of unburdening was difficult for me to support with students. So one of the experiences I had was to sort of work hard to say African-American literature is something that you'll have to learn about as well, and then you can tell me about yourself. Stanley, I remember, I don't think you said this directly to me, but I remember you're saying at some point, once you have to go to the bylaws, you're in trouble. Well, that explained a lot about what had happened, in the department. And also to count the votes before the meeting. That was quite helpful. But also, you hired me after Skip left. And I think it was a move of desperation for which I'm very happy about. He and I talked recently in remembering those early years and how much we both
felt we owed to you to opening pathways we might not have had. But Skip was, yeah, I could say, I remember saying to someone, well, I'm cuter than Skip was, but that's all I can give you. You know, I am happy to have had that opportunity. As dean, I was saying, okay, you're going to teach and you're going to do research and we're going to build this institute, which sometimes I worry about, took away from that intellectual departmental life at Duke by giving us, you know, Charlie Peel always talked about, are you for anti-departmentalism? And I was for those intellectual spaces, which I'm always so grateful to see that the Franklin Institute has become. But I don't know if we've done the departments the service that also needs to be done for them. I don't know what it's like either, because this is like the second time I've been back at Duke since I left. So I owe a lot to the folks who sort of helped me to understand what the teaching enterprise and the service enterprise and what we owed to the department and the university was like, and the barriers that existed, so I could figure out whether or not to try to burst through that or to leave it be. So this was a thank you to all of you.
If there was ever someone for whom the phrase larger than life seemed appropriate, it was and is Skip. I hired Skip on an escalator rather, going at one of the MLAs. He was coming down, and I was going up, and I said across the divide, "Will you come to Duke?" And he said, characteristically, "Let's talk about it." So that happened. But once he arrived at Duke, if the Duke community, as it had been then constituted, experienced difficulty in assimilating people like Jane and me, assimilating Skip was simply a task far beyond its capacities. They didn't know what to make of Skip. They also didn't know what to make of Skip's unconcern of what they made of him. He couldn't have cared less. He immediately bought the biggest house he could find, which led people to think that he had the largest salary in the university. And since I knew what the salary was, since I dispensed it as it was, I know that the salary was totally commensurate with his experience and abilities, and was maybe the 75th highest salary in the universities. But the stories around Skip were legion. In a way, Skip took the pressure away from some of us by offering himself as the receptacle of all of the anxieties, both academic inside the university and local in the Durham community and outside the university, all the anxieties that attended what was going on at Duke. Now, Skip's tenure at Duke was too short from my point of view, as was the tenure of Anthony Appia, who Skip brought with him, but it still did produce its effects. Now, Skip himself had an attitude towards the university which can be quickly characterized by his name for it, the plantation. He called it the plantation, and I got a full sense of this one time when Jane was away and Duke was in the finals of the NCAA basketball tournament. And so I invited Skip and his father to come and watch the game with me in a house that he had previously rented, our house. Oh, this is another side story. Skip rented our house when we were away in California. I came back to do a piece of business in Durham, and I decided I'd go up and see Skip, say hello to him. So I walked up the driveway of my house. Skip came to the entryway, looked down on me and said, can I help you? Which was pure skip. Which was pure skip. There we were, watching the game. It was against Las Vegas, that is UNLV. And about halfway through the first quarter, I realized that they were rooting for UNLV. So it's a very complicated story, which I'm sure he could tell, and I hope will tell better than I have.
Annabelle.
I'm probably the only one here. I'm probably the only one here who was here before Stanley and Jane came, I think, maybe. And the Duke that they came to was the Duke that I knew pretty well already, which was in many ways exactly what you described. But I wanted to add that it was also a little less self-conscious and more open than places that I'd taught before. The interdisciplinary discourse that began then has become entrenched in Duke, when it was much later trendy to become interdisciplinary. Duke was already at it and knew how to do it well. Things have not changed so much since you've gone, but they haven't gotten worse. They didn't go backwards. And I think I speak for a lot of people who just say how much we appreciate the huge effect that you had on our academic lives. Thank you.
Thanks. Helen, let's take one from you. I know we are at time, but let's just hear from Helen.
Stanley, you started with your Duke origin story with a phone call. So I have to say in gratitude, I remember getting a call a Saturday morning, 8:30, from Jane in Toronto. And you were there to recruit me. So I got up out of bed, thought, what am I doing? Took my bicycle and cycled into downtown Toronto to see you at 9 o'clock in the morning. So many decades later, thank you for that. And Jane, because you talk specifically about what it was to work with women in your early years, I'd be curious who the three women you mentioned were who greeted you. I remember Linda Orr, because Linda Orr in Romance Studies and I hope you do. But I think to remember what it is to recruit, which you both played such an indispensable, creative, iconoclastic, forward-looking way. Linda was side by side in my memory, Jane, with you, and precisely on the front of recruiting women, as Annabelle and Charles say, across the humanities. And actually, I think it had a triggering effect across Duke, because there were these groups of activist women faculty that you helped organize. So I say that because I'm moved, Jane and Stanley, by the way that you talk about where it took you. And you asked us so generously, Jane, where it's taken us since. And I would say that one of the things is precisely the commitment to recruitment of new faculty. And that is inspiring to see, even with all of the debates. The debates are key, as Stanley says. The ongoing recruiting of faculty at the starting fresh off out of the blocks stage. And secondly, echoing something that Charles said to you that I'm also hugely grateful for you in a time-released way, is what it is collaboratively across departments to work closely that way. I would say that Leo Ching, as our new Dean of Arts and Humanities, coming from a smaller, internationally multilingual department, will play perhaps a similar role.
Two of the three, I believe, were Jane, whose last name I Jane Gaines, who was the film person, and Gino Barr, who you all know is, I don't remember, there was a third person, and I'm not sure who it was. It might have been Deborah Pope, but I'm not sure. Well, I don't know. They recruited a third person. I don't remember who it was. But the below stairs analogy holds. And it's not like that anymore, is it? I mean, it's not like that, is it? I mean, look, this is the head of the Humanities Center. Come on.
Well,
practice. I mean, we had to make it an institutional
Yes.
practice as well as an intellectual one.
Yes,
Because we
yes.
were hiring people who knew stuff from many different fields, but departments participating in that changed the architecture, the sense of the institution.
well, I mean, something I will say, since you asked me to say something about this. When I arrived at Duke, I do remember that there was a couple of meetings in the English department where I felt as if the women were speaking in a code in a department meeting that I didn't quite understand. And I remember saying something and later being told, well, we thought that you meant that when you said something in the department meeting. And I was saying, no, actually, I just meant what I said. And I realized that there was a culture of actually not speaking your mind among the women, even then. I think that that's changed now. I mean, I think it's completely changed now. That was 24 years ago. So I do think that something has changed, but it was definitely there. I think also, something I would say that often, junior faculty are assigned mentors when they come in, and which I think is a good thing on the whole. Although sometimes those mentors are picked for disciplinary reasons or expertise, and they don't necessarily do the work of mentoring. And so what I would say about that is that there are women faculty who do a disproportionate amount of mentoring, advising on how to navigate the institution. That's still there, and I think that that's there. Probably, I don't think that that's something that is exclusive to Duke. And it's about a political commitment to doing that work and a recognition that it still needs to be done. And a surprise also that it still needs to be done. But there we are. It still needs to be done. So the work is done by many women in the institution. Yeah.
As you're talking back and forth, I'm reminded of an incident that took place in our first year, which illustrates both what the old Duke was like in a positive way and at the same time in a perhaps less than positive way. I was not the chairman of the department in our first year. The chairman of the department was a Renaissance scholar by the name of George Williams, a native, I think, of Savannah, of Charleston. South. Yeah, I see. So one Sunday morning, after I'd either played basketball or run around the neighborhood and was suitably dressed in my usual outfit of shorts and sweaty T-shirt, and we were sitting around, perhaps beginning breakfast. Jane's parents, I believe, were visiting us at the time. And I look out the window, and we had a fairly long driveway. And coming up the driveway in formal dress, Sunday morning, there were the chairman, George Williams, and his wife, Harriet, I believe. And I thought to myself, have I forgotten something? What's happening? And I opened the door and they came in, and it turned out that that was a tradition, at least in the department, that new faculty members would be visited, quote unquote, of a Sunday morning by the chairman. And I suppose, as in some Christian traditions, we were supposed to be ready for it, which we were not. Now, that's an amazing anecdote when you think about it, but it has its good aspects too, when you think about it. And there was that part, that part of Duke, which is emblematized in its architecture and in the way in which the campus is planted and so forth. And it was worth something and remains, I think, worth something.
With that, we should probably close off. I do think that something that is very striking about Duke, which goes to this question of recruitment, it goes to the question of the life of the departments and the institute, is that there is a sense of hospitality, whether it's Southern hospitality or whether it's another kind of hospitality. I'm not sure, but the openness to discussion, the welcoming, I think, of the whole person, an acknowledgement that people have lives and not only jobs. I do think that that's something that we do try to emphasize here, and I thank you for participating in the creation of that. I arrived just after you left, and feel like a huge beneficiary of the stimulating times that you brought, and also the openness to understanding that people live their lives here and not just that have their jobs here. And thank you both very much.
I just wanted to add that something that is no less amazing than the sustaining of the Duke's community is the sustaining of a marriage of 46 years between two people who believe entirely different things and have entirely different philosophies about almost everything.
Well, congratulations.